Welcome, everyone, to the William Morris Society of the United States session on reading news from nowhere in a pandemic. I'm Michael Robertson from the College of New Jersey, and I'd like my colleague, Meghan Freeman, will introduce this session and begin introducing the students.
Sounds wonderful. Hello, everyone. So as my colleague said, I'm Meghan Freeman, and I'm an associate professor in the English department at Manhattanville College. And today's panel was a sort of a long time coming in the sense of, I think we started thinking about it at the end of the pandemic. But in this final form, it's actually, I think, the most perfect realization of what it could be. And what we are hoping to do over the course of the next half hour is to have a spirited conversation about the experience of reading news from nowhere in the midst of a global pandemic. And the sort of structure of it in terms of sort of what might not be visible unless we sort of explain it ahead of time is that Michael and I have both taught news from nowhere in the context of separate classes. In my case, I taught it as part of a class that I offered last spring. And basically it was a course which I will not go into great detail, but just to explain it so we can get a sense of also just the very interesting contexts in which these two groups of students read Morris's utopian novel. It was a course called Overstuffed: Material Pressures in Victorian Literature. And it was an upper level seminar, and most of the students were English majors. And it was a course devoted generally to literary investigations of Victorian materiality and sort of specifically Victorian anxieties about material culture. And the course sort of, and I won't go into great detail, but we sort of followed our way through different texts that in different ways engaged with Victorian questions about materiality, starting with Carlyle's Sartor Resartus, moving into Tennyson's In Memoriam, and in through from there, Dickens's Bleak House. Originally, pre-pandemic, we were supposed to read Morris, and then we were going to end with Rudyard Kipling's Kim. But then the pandemic happened and everything went to pieces. And when the dust cleared and all of my students heroically made the journey with me onto basically a new virtual world, we found that several weeks had elapsed and we cut Rudyard Kipling's Kim from the roster. And that left us with the end of the term to work with news from nowhere. And in some ways, it couldn't have been a more perfect text to end with, because we got to talk about the purposes of utopian thinking in particularly moments like the one that we were in, the pandemic. And Morris's vision in particular, I think, addresses many of the anxieties that people had. And so for today, I invited two of my wonderful students from that class. They both have graduated now, and I miss them every day, Ezra Friedlander and Juliette Macron. And they're going to contribute some of their thoughts and insights about reading news from nowhere last semester. So do you want to introduce your class then, Michael, and then we can go from there?
Yes, I would be delighted. So again, Michael Robertson, professor of English at the College of New Jersey, and I am here with three students. Together we read News from Nowhere in an special honors first year seminar this fall called The Simple Life. And so we read News from Nowhere, not in the context of Victorian literature, but in the context of a wide range of texts, beginning with Thoreau's Walden, and then drawing short works from economics and psychology, anthropology, works that examine the history of this simple life from the 19th century to today. And Morris's utopia fits in interesting and complicated ways with that tradition. I've invited three of those first year students to join us today. Zaniah Anderson-McCoy is a first-year student majoring in political science. Emily Reeves is majoring in psychology and pre-med, and Mikey Cabrera is a history major. So I would turn it over to Professor Freeman, who's going to throw out the first question. I would encourage all 5 of the students to go ahead and unmute so that you can speak more spontaneously, because we're eager to hear from all of you.
So the first question that we were going to ask today, although I'm the one reading it, it actually was Michael's question, and it was so great that I thought it should be delivered to both groups. So this is first question we would love to hear from all of you. And you've seen the question, but just to restate it, the question essentially is, what was your personal takeaway from studying news from nowhere in the middle of a global pandemic? So I think that gets us right to the heart of things, and would love to hear any of your thoughts and answers to that question.
I don't know if oh, sorry. Is that all right with
Yes,
y'all if I go first? Okay.
Nope.
So I don't know if I really had like a personal takeaway, because to me, Morris's utopia was very much, as is many utopias, contextualized both to his socio-historical moment as well as to his position within that moment of history. So as in, like, he was writing from this position of a, I believe, white, seemingly, I don't actually know what his class level was, but man in a society that privileged pretty much all of those identifiers. So his idea of a utopia is not necessarily, to me, going to, I'm a little bit like, okay, that's cool for you, but like, is that actually going to be a good utopia for me? So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I'm not sure I had a personal takeaway.
I think that is totally fair. Although it sounds like in some ways the takeaway was that for you, you see utopias as very much having an expiration date when the sort of their moment of composition passes. What about the rest of you? Did News from Nowhere feel very much Victorian in a way that, or at least from a long time ago, in the sense that you didn't see necessarily its applicability to your own lives, or were there aspects of it that resonated?
I could go. Personally, I think that there were certain aspects that could be applicable, and I'm not sure if that's because when we read it, we were a little further into the pandemic. So honestly, like at this point, I'm literally uncomfortable seeing people in crowds and seeing people grouped together. But something that Morris really highlights is like the importance of community. And since we recently had Thanksgiving and most people, if you were being safe, weren't really gathering in the big groups that might be typical of the holiday, it kind of brought me to the feast that they have in the novel. And the like importance of that community. And there's an anthropology term called communitas, which is basically the feeling of being a part of something and being with other people. So unlike some authors like Professor Robertson mentioned, we read Thoreau's Walden, who he like really focuses on isolation. I think Morris's focus on community and the community working together was something really important and nice to read about when we couldn't necessarily get together with our community or connect.
That's a really beautiful insight. And in some ways, you are right. The quote that I always come back to with News from Nowhere is when he describes the subway, right? The sort of the going in the subway as an experience of a vapor bath of hurried and discontented humanity. But I think with the isolation that we're all in now, some days even a trip on the subway sounds nice. But I think what you're pointing out is also just the value that Morris saw in, you're right, sort of, again, communal experience. And of course now there's so much anxiety tied up in that. What if that's really great? What about the rest of you? Other things that sort of resonated?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I'm just going to try to phrase this as concisely as possible because I can tend to be long-winded. I feel in a lot of ways like the timing in which you read it in the pandemic kind of informed how you felt about it, because the first time I read this twice. I read this back in April, May when our class read it, and then this morning to refresh for today. And I remember when I read it in April, we were kind of in that purgatory lockdown. No one knows what's going on. And there was a sense of like, everything's going to go back to normal soon. Like, this is just kind of a pause. So I didn't really connect that much with the utopia because I was in the same mindset of like, this is going to be over by June, we'll be fine. And then June of 2020 happened. And over the summer, there was a lot of unrest and there was a lot of protests and there was a lot more of this idea that we were actually moving towards some form of a revolution or at least systemic change with the defund the police and, you know, setting up that discourse, whether you agree with it or not, people were talking about it. And when I'm rereading this and I'm getting to the part where he says, like, where William asks, like, well, what was the, I think he said the 1950s or what led to this? And then Old Hammond doesn't want to answer at first. And then he's like, well, there was a lot of violence. The people were trying to work with the system and then they realized that they couldn't. And that just really stuck to me as, you know, how much of the unrest over the summer. And then that also just left me with disappointment because I kind of feel like we didn't get as far as we wanted to go with that change. Like, we're not on track for this utopia, unfortunately, or our own utopia, but yeah, that was long-winded. I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't at all. And it's also, I think, a really important reminder, Juliette, that, I mean, we're talking about this in relation to the pandemic, but you're right. This is a moment where there are so many other crucial changes happening in culture. And I hadn't even thought about sort of how those aspects of it would resonate. So I think that's really important. So Naya, I'd love to hear what you also had to say.
Yes. So for me, it was more of I would say a realization instead of a takeaway. There were parts in the story where I kind of envied William because he's going on like this long journey. And in the context of a pandemic, I'm locked inside of my house. There's nowhere to go. And just seeing how friendly the people are, like when he gets to different towns, people let him in their house. And even like in society regularly, that would be weird. But in the middle of a pandemic, something like that would never happen. So there are parts where like I envy the lifestyle that he has. And there was also something else that I wanted to say. I lost my train of thought, but I forgot. I'm sorry. I can't remember.
No, that's a fantastic comment, though, in and of itself. And I think, again, I mean, what I love is that you also focused on, I mean, one of the few ways that utopian narratives actually move is through physical movement. Mm-hmm. And you're right. It's a sort of narrative where we get to see over and over again Morris's sort of vision of an integrated but decentralized world where people can kind of move where they will. And you're right. Right now, that is not the world that we occupy.
Yes. Okay. I remember actually. So the way that things are set up, like how everybody is like kind of participating in like this communal thing that everybody's doing, and there's no money that really exists. The kind of lifestyle that they have is something that I kind of wish existed at a time like this, because at the point where the pandemic happened, everybody in the house started to contribute in some way, whether it was through working, cooking, whatever it was, everybody had to contribute. So I think it really created a like communal space in our homes.
Oh, that's really nice. Mm-hmm. So Mikey, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I see your finger.
Just to jump off of what Naya said, one of the things that I took away from this was the thought that everyone in the community was an essential worker. Because when the whole pandemic broke out, I had family members who lost their jobs and they didn't work for months and months on end until finally things kind of, came back to normal. But in the William Morris Society, everyone is an essential worker. Everyone's job is necessary for the community to succeed, whether they're a tailor, whether they work in the factories, whether they farm the food they eat, everyone does something that's important. And I thought during a pandemic like the one we had, I kind of envied going back, like even having a society or going back to normality as it was before this whole this whole thing occurred.
Oh, that's really fascinating. And I mean, you're right in terms of thinking about the way that even our concept of sort of the essential worker, it creates a hierarchy, but it also forces us to sort of think about people and weigh and measure the value of their contributions. And that's a really, I think, interesting and important point when we sort of think about how we move forward from this. And again, all of these comments are incredibly suggestive. I mean, we could keep going, Michael, but what do you think? We only have half an hour.
These are indeed, thanks, you guys are great readers. Let me turn to Ezra and Juliette, though, because I was extremely intrigued that Professor Freeman, after you finished reading the novel, asked you to do a create your own utopia assignment. She sent that to me, and I was extremely intrigued. And I wondered how your own utopian imaginings connected with or radically differed from Morris's.
Well, reading it again today to refresh myself of what the utopia I wrote was about, I can safely say I hate it. But like, not the idea of the utopia, just like the writing itself. I was like, ooh, that was clearly at the stress of end of semester writing. And I would say that a big thing was kind of like going off of what Naya and Mikey were both saying. It was very much connected to the economy of like where I had with the premise of my utopia like writing was basically that there was this person and they were journaling because their parent told them to, but I also did a different thing with gender than Morris did because for various Victorian related reasons, his gender philosophy was terrible in my opinion. So there was something completely different that I did with that. And then they were just talking about their day and they were like, oh, and I also really didn't like the way that Morris was like, yes, everyone's happy all the time and everyone's content. And so there was that also differed where I was like, people experience emotions. That's how we human. And so there was that part of it. But then there was also a large part where it was like, the schooling was very similar, where you could choose what you wanted to learn that day. And then no matter what age you were, you could go to school and all of it was free. And then, so like I had my character go to a history class and they were learning about the pandemic. And I was specifically referring to parts of, at the time, it was like, those news headlines of, homeless people in LA, they're being asked to or forced to, I can't remember the wording, to, sleep on parking lots 6 feet away from each other, but, hotels lie empty. And it's like, part of my French, but what the fuck? Why that makes no sense. And so it was just almost like, in a way, my outrage was being spoken through the protagonist in this little utopia of like, that's not how in this utopian world, like that's not how we do things. And like, there isn't any money. It's just, you go by favors because I think the concept of money is kind of stupid. But anyway, sorry. That was kind of long because I know we don't have that much time left, but that was what utopia was.
No, Ezra, that's great. And I love both your congruences with Morris's vision, how radical it still is, his vision of education, his vision of an economy with that's based on exchange of gifts, and yet how important it was for you to go beyond what he proposed in things like gender. That's really interesting. Juliette, do you want to talk about yours?
Yeah, so again, trying to word this concisely. So I reread mine today too, because I completely forgot what I wrote about. And in some ways, I feel like I didn't answer the actual prompt because my piece was a lot more like a personal reflection / anxiety attack over not knowing what I want to come out of this and not knowing what my utopia is. And the way the essay was structured was just kind of like talking about how I was taking a walk in my neighborhood and like just kind of thinking about, for instance, like a conversation I had with my dad 5 minutes prior about how people are going to change following this pandemic and how in the Great Depression, people became much more frugal after the Depression was over. And I said, I said to my dad, well, maybe we're going to implement universal basic income after this because we can't live paycheck to paycheck anymore. And he said, nah, I don't think so. Thinking about that, I was thinking about a conversation I had with my friends about movie theaters taking a hit and possibly never coming back. And I love movie theaters, so I was upset about that. And basically the whole point of it was like, there were things that I was hoping would change. Like I was hoping that we would care more about our health. Like, in the past we used to actually go to work even if we had flu symptoms, which is crazy to think about now. Even though it wasn't quite the summer of 2020 yet, there were already all these discrepancies pointed out between how police were treating different neighborhoods. Like in Williamsburg and in Harlem, you got fined for not wearing your mask, whereas in the West Village, if you didn't have a mask, they just gave you one. So I wanted to address these class differences in the post-pandemic world. But then there was also just that I couldn't really see ahead of what the future held, and I really wanted to hold on to what the past had. So in a way, my utopia was kind of like almost just going back to normal, like going back to seeing your friends and gatherings and going to the parks and going to Coney Island. And so, yeah. It's a mix of like, I don't want things to change, but change happens whether you want it or not.
I'm thinking of the comment of a famous book about famous history of utopias that says utopias come out of times of tumult. They come out of times of social unrest. And Juliette, your utopia sounds like a perfect example of that because it responds so strongly to this moment of social dislocation that we're all experiencing. Meghan, I'd like to turn to you because I know you wanted to pose a question to the three students in my class.
Yes, and in some ways it's complementary to the question that you just asked to Juliette and Ezra, because of course with the assignment that I gave to Juliette and Ezra, I was sort of forcing them to sort of engage with Morris in terms of thinking about their own ideas of what would make a better world. And of course, I think, again, one of the things that's interesting about both of your responses is how difficult it actually is to do that, how frustrating it is to actually, in a moment, sort of think about, how would I fix this? How would this work? And in some ways, you both engaged with Morris in terms of looking at his model and finding the parts of it that resonated, like his tremendous anxiety, which came across in Juliette's, which really read like your own take on the sort of frame narrative of News from Nowhere. And then with Ezra's, this kind of, again, a response that was actually, I thought, very pointed to some of what limitations of his vision. And so my question to the three of you in some ways develops upon that part of it. I'm interested in sort of thinking about, as you sort of read News from Nowhere, if you were imagining yourself essentially in the business of proselytizing Morris's vision of utopia to, let's say, your friends, your parents, what parts of it do you think would be the toughest sell? What aspects of Morris's utopia do you think would be the hardest aspects to convince somebody today is the best of all possible outcomes? And the sort of the adjacent question to that is kind of connected to it, which is, are there parts of his vision that you think actually don't fit to our modern sort of understanding of basic human rights, personhood, right? I mean, all of these different things. So as Ezra and Juliette will tell you, all of my questions usually have about 15 sub-questions. And my general invitation is answer any one of those sub-questions you find interesting.
Well, when it comes to the hardest sell, I always thought that the idea of marriage and relationships within the framework of News from Nowhere was always very strange. Since there's no marriage and the relationship is very flowing, I think, like Ezra pointed out, people have emotions, and I don't think that sort of framework would really work in real life. People get attached, or they would get jealous, or they would get angry, and then that's when crime would come in, or who knows, something like that. And when it comes to something that's most appealing, I've after reading the book, I talked to a lot of my friends about it because I thought, there's nothing else to talk about during a pandemic, so I just talk about the books you read. And whenever I would bring up the fact there was no currency in this world, they were like, "Oh my God, that's such a good idea. Why don't we do that in real life?" And they were like, I always tell them that it's a society based off favors. You do something and someone does something for you. And they always thought that would be a perfect way to, form a society. And those are,
those are
both two aspects of it that are good and bad.
That's really interesting. Again, I could follow that out, but Naya, Emily, I'd love to also get some of your responses, and then we can wind it all together.
I think the hardest sell would have definitely been leaving punishment up to the individual. Even when I read it, I'm just like, there's no way. I don't think that there are certain crimes that I don't think should be left up to individuals. And even like explaining it to my family, like I have family members who think that rape, pedophilia, those things should result in a death sentence. So I definitely don't think that's something that could be sold. And in a time like this, the things that we saw during the pandemic, the violence with police officers, even though there's no police officers in this world, the violence that we just saw, I think it would be unleashed in that kind of role. So I don't think I could sell that. But I do think I admire everybody learning what they wanted to learn. So education, I admired that portion, and I was definitely excited about college, like being able to choose my own classes. That was one thing that excited me the most about college, and just like exploring my actual interests instead of taking mandatory classes that I wouldn't use in the future. So I would love that part.
That's great.
Yeah, going off what Naya had mentioned, I think in some parts the kind of lack of a criminal justice system would definitely be an extremely hard sell. But our nation is so divided that I think some people might actually find that somewhat appealing. But like Naya said, there are some more extreme cases where punishment might not shouldn't be left up to the individual. Like another student in our class, I think, had mentioned sociopaths, because a lot of it is based off of your own remorse, and sociopaths don't feel that remorse. So in that token, they wouldn't really be punishing themselves. But I think it's interesting that it tries to focus a little bit more on reform rather than just punishment and rehabilitation. And then I had thought that one of the most appealing things might actually be a lack of an overarching government, especially with everything we've seen with the pandemic, because of the response honestly would have been much different if politics weren't a factor. And I think everybody knows that, no matter what, if they're more conservative or more liberal, or what their approach to politics is. I think we all know that an approach to a potentially deadly global pandemic that was killing a lot of people would have been much more different if there wasn't politics in the picture, or if there wasn't an overarching government that was trying to control everything, and communities were able to respond, and communities that actually cared about each other were able to kind of take the reins on the response.
This is really interesting. I mean, and again, just your immediate comment, most recent one, of course, it's Parliament, isn't it, that he turns into a dung market in a storehouse for manure in News from Nowhere. So certainly Morris was skeptical about sort of the storied political institutions of his time. But it seems as though, I mean, what's really quite interesting is how both sort of sets of responses to different questions, both groups, you seem to be coming up with sort of interesting points of commonality, that you all find something hopeful in the understanding of a kind of a looser or more decentralized structure with this idea of more individual choice. And at the same time, it seems as though you also are all skeptical that human nature can be perfected to the degree that Morris desperately wants to believe it can be, if we just take away all of these sort of corrupted and corrupting institutions. So it's a fascinating, I feel like you see both the utopian potential and it excites you, but there's also a sort of sense of frustration with an unwillingness to look at how messy it is to be a human being. So I feel as though it's, in some ways, it's perfect, Michael, in the sense that we are right at 5:30. Can we open it up to questions?
I agree. Let's, if people would like, people gathered here would like to unmute yourself. And I think we have time for a couple of questions. We'll just go for maybe 5 or 6 minutes longer, but would people like, we've got a, well, Megan and I both do this. We have a wonderful group of 5 students, and I, for one, would like to hear a bit more from them before we close. Are there any questions from folks who are gathered? Yes, Sarah Leonard.
Yes, hi. I'm still sort of formulating this question as I'm going, but I'm thinking about my own work from News from Nowhere, which is a lot about the rural aspects of the novel, because I work a lot with Morris in the city and the countryside. And I was wondering, especially, I don't know where any of you all are based, but I know there were some mentions of New York City. And I was wondering if any of you thought about place and your own ideas of utopia or the ideal space, especially like with the pandemic. Like, I left a city and moved home to the country during this time because it was easier to be in the country. So I wondered if any of you were thinking about any of those aspects. And also, thank you. This has been wonderful. It's so good to hear other people talking about Morris.
So I can go first unless anybody else.
Please, Ezra.
Okay, so thanks for the question. And in my little write-up of Utopia, I did actually specifically refer to place, but I referred to it as town life versus city life. And that, like, where you live was just dependent upon what your preferences were, because I'm in a suburb of New York City. So for me, what's really nice is that, like, I'm also really surrounded by a lot of nature, and I mean, it's pretty, but also I can easily walk around and not have to really worry about maintaining social distance, because it's just kind of natural to do so. And I think that there's not enough, like, I think like what Mikey was saying, like in the way beginning about how like everyone's an essential worker, like there's not enough of value, I think, placed upon the kind of labor that you associate with the countryside. There's not enough value placed on it in current society, I mean. So those are kind of like where my thoughts go, but I don't necessarily know if I would argue for like getting rid of the city entirely either, because I know it has its own merits. Did that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah. Anybody? Well, we have a question from Peter Stansky.
This has been a very interesting discussion, and I wonder what the splendid students think. It seems to me an unexpected result in a way is, I think it's always been thought in the past that the idea of these small communities functioning efficiently seemed, in News from Nowhere, seemed very idealistic. And I think the extraordinary thing that may have happened with the pandemic, I think it's made us much more conscious that we live in small communities, and in a way that there's so much variation with way, say in California, where I am, the counties all have sort of different regulations. And I think we're much more conscious of being in small communities than we might have been before the pandemic. And in a way that seems to make what some have thought, as I say, Morris much more practical than we might have thought before. So I wonder if there's a reaction to that feeling, which again was suggested a bit in what the last student was saying.
I can answer. That's okay.
Please.
Go ahead, Emily.
I think that since someone had said, I forget, had said that the utopian societies, I think it was Professor Robertson actually, the utopian writings often come from a place of social unrest. I think the relatability, like we had discussed, that the perspective on like news from nowhere could change depending on where you're at in the pandemic. And I think our sense of community becomes, and communities working together in some ways becomes much stronger during a time of like discourse. Like I remember during Hurricane Sandy, my entire neighborhood, because some of us had generators, some of us didn't. So our entire neighborhood came together, and we were either barbecuing for the entire neighborhood, or we were cooking potatoes on a fire, and everybody was making sure that people could shower, like the people who had generators. So I think being in a time where so much is happening and nobody really knows what's going on, but we know that something is changing, and we know that there's some kind of conflict. I think that really changes our perspective on community. And like I had said, I think that's why being in the pandemic is so difficult, because we're all trying to deal with this in isolation. And a lot of us don't necessarily have the support of a community that we can reach out to, but it makes us appreciate the communities that we have within our homes or within our neighborhoods, if it's social distancing, and even online, the communities that we can reach out to safely there.
I wonder if, Emily, thank you. That's very eloquent, and I think that might be a good note to end on. It reminds me so much of a beautiful book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, which is about what Solnit calls disaster utopias, and the way that times of crisis often, although the popular narrative is that they bring out the worst in people, she points out that often in times of great crisis, it can bring out the best and can form these extraordinary communities of self-help and mutual aid. So
maybe I should just mention, if I might, Rebecca Solnit, who of course lives in San Francisco, and she's participating in an Orwell symposium that I'm taking part in tomorrow. New book that she's just completed, which is about Orwell, but it's about Orwell as a vegetable gardener. It's Orwell in his most rural and in a way in his most Mauritian mode. So it's a nice coincidence that you just mentioned her.
Thank you, Peter. And Meghan, could I give you the last word before we close?
Oh, but you were so well on your way to wrapping it up so beautifully. This will just feel, you can give me the afterthought, which is just that I'm thinking about the last point that sort of Emily made, and you sort of moved from sort of hot dogs and sort of potatoes in the fire to online communities. And I thought what was really wonderful about that is that it seems as though we also talk about adapting utopian thinking, and I think community, the idea of it resonating. One good thing that has come out of so much of this is that we are thinking more creatively about how to do community building. And although Zoom is not as satisfying oftentimes as it would be to be in a room, nevertheless, without this pandemic and this occasion, we wouldn't have all been able to get together here. And I wouldn't have had the pleasure of talking and listening to all of you. So it's really just wonderful. And I already knew my students were inspiring, but it's wonderful to meet other inspiring students. And just thank you for your thoughtfulness, all of the ways that you have continued in this sort of moment as we struggle to sort of make community and make meaning. And so I guess I will end with a thanks, a hearty thanks, a Mauritian hearty thanks.
And I'll just say, hear, hear. So thank you to our students. You were wonderful. Thank you all for listening. And it's been a pleasure.
It has.
Good evening.
Okay, thank you.